I called the June 24th work session meeting of the Portsmouth City Council to order. And Madam Deputy Clerk, will you call our roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Battle?
Here.
Mr. Clark?
Here.
Mr. Glover?
Here.
Vice Mayor Lucasberg?
Here.
Mr. Moody?
Here.
Ms. Simmons?
Here.
Mayor Rowe?
Here. And this is a joint meeting with our Planning Commission. And sir, would you like
It's
to?
indeed a pleasure to be with all of you, Mr. Mayor. It gives us a great opportunity to go do some great things. Ms. Jackson, would you call the roll for the Planning Commission, please?
Yes. Commissioner Williams,
Here.
Commissioner Thompson,
Here.
Commissioner Youngblood,
Here.
Commissioner G, Commissioner Thaxton,
Here.
Commissioner Ricks, Commissioner Coleman.
Here.
6 members of the Planning Commission are present.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for first, your service to our great city, your volunteers, and your scarcest resource like ours is your time, and the fact that you give so much time to the development of our city. Speaking for council, we're mighty grateful for that. And thank you for meeting with us tonight. We're working jointly together on the development of a new zoning ordinance. And would you like to make any opening comments?
No, it's just a pleasure to be here. It gives us an opportunity to serve, even though we do serve as volunteers. It's a pleasure to serve the citizens of the city of Portsmouth. It's just a pleasure to be here.
Just one editorial comment. We changed the geography of the room.
Yes.
So that our backs wouldn't be to the people who show up here from the public. And so this may help the sound. This is a challenging room, sound-wise. And so with that, Dr. Patton?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Lucasberg, members of City Council, Chairman Williams, and members of the Portsmouth Planning Commission. Tonight's zoning rewrite update and discussion will provide an opportunity for City Council and the Planning Commission to hear a briefing and engage in a discussion regarding the rewrite of the Portsmouth zoning ordinance. This briefing is a follow-up to the joint work session held in November 2018. Tonight's discussion will be focused on 2 critical areas of zoning: non-conformities in zoning terminology, current ordinance, distance separation requirements, and finally, the concept of overlay districts. Deputy City Manager Bob Baldwin will lead tonight's briefing and discussion. During his presentation, there will be times of pause so that both the members of council and the Planning Commission could ask questions, get clarifications. But our hope as a result of this meeting that we can get the concurrence from both council and members of the Planning Commission that staff can move forward with the final rewrite of the zoning ordinance.
So you're actually looking feedback from both bodies tonight?
Yes.
Okay, good. We're ready.
All right.
Thank you, and good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Lucasberg, Chairman Williams, Vice Chairman Thompson, and Chairman Thompson, and members of City Council and the Planning Commission. It's certainly my pleasure, and hopefully not too much pain for you to go through this tonight. It's a relatively lengthy presentation, but a very important one as we begin to move along through the zoning ordinance. And I'm going to start off tonight. I know we have a few members in the room who were not here back in November, and we want to kind of bring everybody kind of up to speed on what's been going on with the project. So we'll do a little background discussion before we move into will be the meat of the discussion tonight. So we'll start off with a little project background. Council may recall, Planning Commission may recall, we spent a fair amount of time at your last work session discussing philosophy and talking about how the 2010 zoning ordinance was put together and some of the philosophies that were built into that the current ordinance, the one we're using primarily today. And a theme I constantly refer back to this is this trying to make sure that your philosophy and then the way you have regulatory execution match up so that what you say you want and what the regulations do, in fact, are consistent. And that, quite frankly, with the 2010 ordinance is one of the primary things that went kind of awry there, that the execution didn't really get to in a lot of ways what the philosophy was. So just, you can see up there, for example, being developer friendly, and you'll see in a minute, we'll talk about the by right uses and having fewer use permits and mixed use districts and type 2 site plan approval. There's a number of things were built into that code trying to be developer friendly. And again, some cases that worked out, some didn't. But the way a lot of these things were done through, again, raising the bar on the quality development through prescriptive design and use-based standards, some additional development standards through non-conforming site aspect requirements. We'll talk about non-conformities tonight. Using design versus use-based as our form-based code districts, the downtown D2 form-based code, and I throw it out the D1 smart code, and not quite as problematic, but certainly similar conceptually. And then the goal of being bike and pedestrian friendly and rather being auto-oriented and some of the impacts that had as we have applied the zoning ordinance. I believe, Councilman Simmons, you asked at the last work session in November, did we really see a decline in use permits when the zoning code changed? Here's a quick bar graph show. Yes, you did. You can see up to that gray line, that's prior to 2000, from blue to that gray. You see the 2001 to 2009, you see you're running in the 30s in some cases in terms of annual use permits. You're looking at 2 and 3 a month. You can see what it looks like post 2010. You're really looking at 1 or 2 a month. So we've had quite a decline in use permits. We can see the same thing happening when you're rezoning numbers. Again, you can see the decline from the pre-2010 era to the post-2010 era. And so that is one of those aspects of the new zoning code that in fact did work. You do have fewer developers coming to council for either rezoning property or for use permits. So that is one of those things that did work out. This is usually the time in the presentation, as I've given this a few times, where I bring all the books in. I show you all the different documents we have to use to apply and use the zoning ordinance, as do developers and property owners, citizens. We've decided to just write them down for you to get kind of the look again. What you see on the left where it says ordinance, that's really 8 chapters our zoning ordinance is currently separated into. Some of the more critical ones, obviously, how we administer the code, the zoning districts, the standards. The development standards you see in Article 5, that would be like parking and landscaping and signage. Our discussion of nonconformities, how we enforce, and then the last article being definitions. Obviously, the way the code was put together, we've got these appendices in there. The downtown D1 itself sits in an Appendix A. Appendix B, the downtown D2, that's your form-based code. We actually have an Appendix C, a residential mobile home district, even though we have no mobile home zoning in the city. We do have a district for it. And then, of course, we have to use the downtown master plan and waterfront strategy and the downtown design manual because there were zoning elements that were incorporated in portions of that document, not completely, but kind of, and that's one of the things, again, making a challenge trying to apply the zoning code because you have to search so many places to find what all the rules are that apply to a certain piece of property. So moving forward to a status update. I know this process has been going on for a while, so we'll go through kind of where we are. And again, for those of you who have a refresher, and for those of you who weren't here back in November, we talked in our discussion with the Planning Commission and Council about what are the goals of this project. And this really goes back to the original council, let's blow the ordinance up conversation, quite frankly. So we wanted a single integrated zoning ordinance instead of having all of those appendices and everything. Wanted to simplify, streamline, be more user-friendly, and quite frankly, Immunicode friendly, which is where our ordinance is hosted for people who look online. And the way our code currently is, it's quite expensive for the city to maintain the way it's currently structured on Immunicode. Eliminating unnecessary regulations, requirements, and things that are impediments to development and redevelopment. Again, eliminating the D1 smart code, the D2 form-based code, replacing that with more traditional zoning. One thing that was asked is ensure the ordinance is in compliance with the state code and to be more developer friendly, but while maintaining good standards. So don't throw all the standards out for being more developer friendly. One thing we discussed back in November, remember we discussed the fact we had the Berkeley group did an analysis of our zoning code, primarily looking to see if we were state code compliant, also kind of gathering information. So this is really where the primary goals, this is what's driving us as we rewrite the code today. So I guess we'll stop for a moment and make sure we're all still good. This is in fact the will of the council, and continue in this regard, if that's in fact your project goals.
Okay. First, Lisa.
Is there a D3? I know D4 is the residential mobile homes, but is there a D3 that we've labeled, or is it?
That's it, D1 and D2. And prior to 2010, our downtown, we got a D1 and a D2. And when they put those two design-based codes in, they continue with the D1 and D2 because people become geographically aware of where the D1 is, where the D2 is, generally speaking. So that terminology stayed on. There's nothing beyond the D1 and D2.
Chen.
Mr. Baldwin, so with the D1 smart code and the D2 form-based code, were they restrictive or did it cause challenges to getting through zoning with these?
Yes and yes plus.
We're going to go into it.
The D1, that's, and the nomenclature you'll hear us describe that, you'll hear us say D1, T4, that's transect, that's smart code terminology. That's a increasing intensity of land use between, in our case, T3 to T6. T6 being like our waterfront most intensive district. And that one hasn't been quite as problematic, but I will tell you that in the days when we were able to use the Type 2 site plan, everyone was going through that Type 2 site plan process trying to modify some of the design requirements in the D1. The D2, the form-based code, has been an absolute nightmare trying to apply. It has a very high level of design prescriptive requirements, not just some suggestions or guidelines. This is what you have to have.
Right.
And so you have this matching up between land use and design mandates. And quite frankly, it was implemented incorrectly. Just to be real honest about it. We'll talk tonight a little bit later on about overlay districts. This should have been an overlay district, and it wasn't. And one of the things that really hurt is when the code was adopted in 2010, you eliminated all the underlying zoning under it. That really put everybody in a quandary.
Right.
And that shouldn't have happened. But yes, to answer your question in a more simple fashion, it's been quite difficult. I think the D2 form-based code sections, when we were hearing from council members in particular about, they were hearing a lot of issues. The other thing is that the D2 really changed the land use from what had been sort of the historical land use pattern in the D2 with something new. I mean, we'll talk about nonconformities tonight. That really created a lot of situations where either the use or the building or something was no longer allowed under the zoning code as it had been prior to the code change. And so
It actually stopped development. For example, Wendy's could not go forward because of, it just couldn't make, yeah.
and we've actually
Well, its location on the property.
and we had two properties that were rezoned out of the D2. Some were probably on one on County Street, one over on London. So we have had that.
I saw it.
Are you all good with the project's primary goals going
Yeah,
forward?
I was getting the questions first.
Yeah.
Everybody good?
Yeah.
Y'all good?
Fine.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, and so just, again, that's sort of as we move forward, and we keep that in mind every time we look at a code section, just to keep in mind, that's what we're trying to accomplish. Back to the code amendments, because of some of these issues, we have been quite busy doing a number of code amendments, some not too big, some extremely large. I really want to skip down to the third one down there, the D2 use permit provisions. That was where Wendy's came along. And we couldn't find a way for Wendy's to get a drive-through into the form-based code. That D2 district allowed for drive-throughs. It just, you couldn't comply with the design standards, and we had no way in the code for someone to get around all of that. So council wanted us to pursue that, and
We call that the
that's
patch.
one of our patches. We have a number of patches. It's like an old tire in pretty bad shape, but that was the first of the patches. One of the things we did do, and again, council members and planning commission do remember, we had a lot of, I'm sure our economic development director is Mr. Moore in here. Robert certainly remembers how many projects we had would come in that couldn't meet the parking standards that were in place at the time. And we spent quite a bit of time working with a consulting firm, VHB. We completely redid our parking requirements from top to bottom, pretty big undertaking. I think we're in pretty good shape with the parking. We'll look as we finish up, we need to tweak that at all, but we fixed, there was a lot of issues with bike parking. I remember some of those, like the Kroger that needed 100 bike parking spaces. So we think we've solved that. We mentioned we did new sign regulations. That was because of the Supreme Court case. You know, we had the case out in Arizona, and everyone in the country just about had to rewrite their sign regulations, and we did that. We found out in this process, our mini storage warehouse, even though we had a couple built under the old code, the nicer looking tall structures, our current code had made that not allowed. Fixed that one. Another patch, residential lot size. This is council getting complaints about small lot infill development. That was a patch, one of our other patches. We fixed the real estate offices, and that was the Old Town designation for real estate offices, professional office. And then another patch is that exemption for lot consolidation. That's where somebody might come and do a minor addition to their house, add a room or something. We were making them, code made them complete. The code was making them vacate all their internal lot lines to do that. So just adding a lot of time and expense for no real practical purpose. So that was a 2018 fix. And those have all been very, I tell you, we see things there quite rarely. It's had a huge, been a huge improvement for people moving through the process. Show you what the new code's gonna look like, kind of simplified. It's gonna look like that. We're gonna narrow it down to six chapters. We may shuffle the deck a little bit on the arrangement, but that's pretty much what you'll have. 6 articles, there'll be no appendices. You'll not have to refer to another book document, anything like that. So that's where we are headed. And again, it'll be section 40.2. Our current one is 40.1. We will repeal the current code completely and replace with 40.2. So that's what the format will look like.
We'll be able to throw away a whole bookcase.
Glad to do that myself. Yes.
What's the timeline, Bob, again? How long has this taken us?
We started in 2015.
Yeah, they first got in, one of the early things we got bogged down was the parking
16 was
issue.
the retreat.
17.
So 17.
17.
Yeah. We started working on those issues, the parking, and then started working on signs.
Yeah, it's been a process.
It's quite a tangled
Yeah.
process to undo. So again, back in November, in our joint meeting, we were going to make sure we're all still on board with what we went through the use table, as you'll recall, some detail. And some guidance we got out of that was to eliminate use permits for drive-through lanes, to eliminate use permits for convenience stores with gas, and to replace those with design standards. You'll note right now, one of the primary things you get use permits for are those exact 2 things. Wendy's, for example, is one. Our Wawa situation. Eliminate use permits for multifamily projects in the downtown and uptown. And the end of the discussion we had back in November was to leave the use permits in place for multifamily outside of downtown, where it was more likely to be impactful of residential neighborhoods. But to go ahead and eliminate the use permits for the downtown and uptown. So we are proceeding with that direction. Want to make sure that everybody's
Is everybody still on board with that?
still on board with that? Okay, and again, that same reduce the number of use permits. Because again, I think council's trying to get to the point where I don't have to come in front of you very often, these use permit. They try to cut down those, and I'm all in favor of that. And then finally, back into our D2 district to revert to our standard zoning districts. And we're going to talk about that a little bit and discuss the overlay concept, which we've had a very short discussion on in the past. So that's kind of where we came out of the November joint meeting. And this is just as an example. This is what the D2 district would look like. And we're still tweaking it. This is what it would look like if you, again, recall the earlier discussion when we did the comprehensive plan, the Build One Portsmouth plan. We had our consultant from within DC did a land use assessment out there. Made these recommendations for applying standard zoning instead of having a special zoning for the D2. And we'll talk to you a little bit about how to put in some of the, we think are some special standards you may still want to consider from the D2.
Which, for the benefit of the public, would you go over the legend?
Sure. So what you have here, this map, thanks for pointing that out. What you see of the districts inside that black, first we're going to focus on what's inside that black outline on there. That's the D2 district. What you'll see in there is a variety of zoning districts. The IL is our light industrial district. We have urban residential, that's that piece of mustard color UR up in the upper left corner. We have neighborhood mixed use, that's really running down the High Street and county corridors, and then as you get more towards Effingham to the right, you'll see it switch over to a general mixed use, and that's really looking on London. And I think we can all see that the London quarter, High Street quarter, the County Street quarter, they're not exactly the same.
Yeah.
So we'll have to work on refining how this works in those quarters. But that's the general overall concept of establishing. And you can see in the legend, you'll see the T districts that were originally marked in there, T3, 4, 5. And that SD is a special district, and that's the old Port Center Commerce Park, and we'll be working on that as well.
And the light industrial lies west of the MLK.
Yes. There's a little bit, but yes.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, primarily it's
Okay.
that.
Is there an HR there?
what's your
No,
question?
no.
Oh, in the legend. Mhm.
Yeah, there is some, again, we talked about overlays, but I think we have some, well, we have no historic districts that are,
Okay.
I'll just put it that way, keep it simple for our historic districts. There's no HR in there,
In the detail.
or any of the historic limited business or.
Why do we have a jog on the east end here? Why doesn't it go all the way down to Effingham? In this area?
The
Why do we
T3.
have that little jog there?
Yeah, I think at the time when they were looking at the land use differences between the old D1 and D2, and I think that was blended at that time as well, that was determined to be a land use changing pattern between the D1 and D2.
Okay.
And we've, it generally will follow property boundaries in there. It was recognizing certain land uses that were in there, trying to make sure that they weren't impacted by the change in the zoning. So when you get on that other side, you get into over into the D1, you get into that T5 transect on the other side. So, and a lot of that was recognizing where the D1 district is, and where that jog is, and that T5 in there. This new zoning district did not encroach into the D1. We already had a T5 district or T6 district. We did not go in and start redoing that.
To state, to ask the question a little bit differently, does that jog create a problem for us?
I don't think the jog does. I will say that whole edge there, I think most people think Effingham is this line, and it's not, and so it's a, but we have had, since this map was done, you may recall when the Wawa at London and Effingham, that got zoned into GMU. That came out of that was split, that was part T, I think it was part T5 or T4, and that was part D2. That one was split because of the way they assembled their parcel. That went to a straight singular GMU with and instead of having an overlay district, that one's got conditional zoning proffers. I would say if you're interested, once we kind of get through this whole process, we'd have to go look at some of these edges that you identify. And if we can find ways to maybe smooth some of these boundary lines out, we'd be glad to do that.
Would it cause any great damage to move that line east to, I think that's Effingham?
And we'd have to look at what's there and not try to create problems for somebody who's already got
Right,
a
property.
land use. Most of our transect districts they're primarily residential. And so obviously when you move over to like the GMU, you're getting to more of a mixed use where there's more commercial potential. But we'd be glad to look at that.
Any other comments?
All right, so the question was, where are we? You mentioned we did the diagnostics, what was the birth of that's been completed. Where we are, this is our 6 sections. You can see we've got the general provision. And when I say the draft's complete, this is a staff draft that's been completed that we will go back and refine over as we put the rest of the ordinance together. But that's complete. The administrative section's been done. We'll do the nonconformity section by the end of July once we get through with our work session tonight. The draft of the definitions is done, and we will then get through the rest of the summer getting through what we need to do to both do the zoning district. And a lot of that work, because of some of your patches, we've done a lot of work on it already. And then the community design, obviously that's all the design standards. Parking's done, signs are done. Some of the bigger pieces of it, you've already done that. So that should be completed by September. And at that point, then we'll go into kind of final cleanup. And again, the goal is to have this thing in a clean version for council by the end of the year. So I think we're pretty much on schedule now with that. Anybody have any heartburn over?
Bill?
Given the I guess, the resistance from the development community on the form-based and D2, et cetera. What are the plans? How are we going to communicate that there's a new day in our permitting process and zoning?
Well, on the D2 form-based code side, we had, during the course of the planning process, and as far as even talking about the potential zoning, had meetings out with an invitation to everyone who was out in the D2 district, and we will invite them back in, because once we move forward with crafting the zoning for them, we'll bring everybody back in. So all those in the D2 district will do that. And then for the rest of it, we'll have to work on an outreach program. Because one of the things we are doing as, and we're gonna move it over, but we do have on the planning department's webpage, we're gonna be hosting all of these documents out there so people can go and take a look, and hopefully we'll start being able to get some comments from people on the fly, so to speak. So these aren't, as we get these things done, we're putting them out so people can go back in and look at them.
Well, I understand the people who are presently located in Portsmouth and these districts, but I'm talking about potential investors, developers in our city that some of the previous zoning kind of left a bad taste in their mouth. I think we need to do some type of communication that, our zoning has changed.
Yeah, good point. Why don't we give that task to the city manager, come up with a communication plan?
We'll come back with a plan as we get closer as to how it will be unveiled.
Good point.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
Okay, so, are we good there?
Good.
Are we good? Okay. So now we're going to get into some of these issues. We're going to ask for a little feedback here. And again, I want you to keep in mind what the philosophy is. You've advised us that you want the zoning code out, so we're going to walk through some additional issues we need to get through. First one is on nonconformities. And normally, in a normal set of circumstances, we probably would not be coming to you to discuss nonconformities as a singular issue. It's generally an issue in zoning that's usually not a giant issue. However, the implications of what happened in 2010 created a large number of nonconformities in Portsmouth and a full range of things that are regulated as nonconforming. So this is having as much impact on development as these other things you've been pointing out you wanted us to fix. This is just one of those things that's out there as well, has a lot of impact on people's ability to use their property or to redevelop.
Before we get into a discussion, can you explain the legal status of a non-conforming use?
Right.
There you go.
Right here. So we have a number. We're going to talk about 5 different types of nonconformities before we get through here tonight. But simply one, we'll talk about a use, a building, or a lot that was legally established. In other words, a person who built it, established it, was operating, did it legally. They were in compliance at the time. Then the zoning changed and took them out of compliance. So, for example, everyone in D2, as an example, or probably 90% of people in D2 became non-compliant with that zoning change. So that would have been a use that was legally established out there, made non-compliant by the change. Again, we follow state enabling legislation, what they allow, the authority they grant us for dealing with nonconformities. And I will point out, I think it's important to keep in mind that the zoning philosophy of nonconformity is to eliminate it, to make it go away, not to keep it, encourage it, let it expand. So you can imagine the kind of impact this had. Also keep in mind, we were in a recession right after the zoning code went into effect. And so a lot of properties were left unused during the recession. When the economy started to pick up, whether it was an existing building or prior use, people started coming in and running up against the non-conforming. So by the state law, we have to give people 2 years to come back in and reestablish a non-conforming use that had been stopped. After 2 years, they have to fully comply with the current code of the time.
Let's say a structure has a fire, and of course the use stops. What's the status then?
That's a different provision. There is a state provision that deals with someone having a fire. We're required to allow them to come back and rebuild. And,
Just as it is?
yeah, on their footprint.
Fire, flood.
Fire. And, well, acts of God, I think is the way they actually describe it.
Acts of
So, yes,
nature,
it could be a
yeah.
flood. That would depend, though, when you're in the flood regulations, it may not be quite so
Yeah.
simple to rebuild. But yes, that's the general idea. And I will, future discussion, we get more into being resilient, dealing with sea level rise and climate change. We'll want to talk about some of these issues out there as they're becoming impacted by zoning. But for the purpose of where we are today, and then the third thing that, again, I mentioned, the presumption is that these nonconformities should be eliminated over time. So that's the,
When you say they should be eliminated over time, say I have a business or whatever, the rules changed, but I'm staying there, I'm not leaving, I'm gonna stay there. So as long as I'm there and I don't leave or somebody, or I close my business and nobody comes to buy me, then I'm still good.
you are to a point, yes. Now, the way the law works, if you have a non-conforming use, and, obviously we want you to do some minimal level of maintenance to keep your building from falling down or so you can still operate, but our current code does not want you to do extensive remodeling or extensive improvements to your property because, again, the code's goal is for you to stop. And that's really an issue. We have a lot of structures. Again, I'll mention, we had out on London Boulevard, we had a couple of those metal buildings. They were used for, back by the cemetery, they had the commercial storage. And those, and I think in the form-based code plan, we're supposed to be, I think townhouse type use or something. And buildings were there. People came in, wanted to reestablish the commercial use of the buildings. And it had been vacant for beyond 2 years. And all of a sudden, now you're in the form-based code territory. You must fully comply. And that's where council ultimately rezoned that property. But that's the intention. So we have a lot of it. It creates a lot of problems for a lot of people when you've created a lot of nonconformity.
Do the mobile home parks that you mentioned earlier?
We have 2 non-conforming mobile home parks.
Right. Now, following up on the Dr. Patton's question about discontinued use, how would that apply? Because they can be removed and replaced?
Right, well, in the case of the 2 we have, one on Victory Boulevard and one on George Washington, it's the site. So we don't do it, it's not trailer by trailer there.
Okay, it's not my trailer,
The
your
whole
trailer.
bound.
It's the whole boundary.
Yeah, I understand that, but how would the use be discontinued?
Well, if, for example, the owner of the property decided to get out of the mobile home business and had everybody move out, and so then they vacated the site, there are no mobile homes occupied, then 3 years later, they come and say, now we're going to start renting it out again.
But the ownership alone wouldn't that?
It's the use. In that case, it's the use. You have to
Okay.
continue the use.
Okay, so
Abandon your use,
so all of them would have to be
pretty much.
removed.
And these are rental parks too. They're
Right.
not individual lots. So
Yeah.
if you
And do
live
have to
there,
allow
you're
people
renting
to
the space.
change out their trailers for newer models. That's a
And they
federal
can do that.
requirement.
Okay.
So we do that.
Okay.
So now we're going to go through our types of non-conforming for our discussion tonight. So we've discussed what about uses. And then
Before we go forward, a clear up a point. Let's say someone's in a 1952 trailer and wants to go to 2019. Can that?
we allow that.
Okay.
We would like them to do that, in fact. They're safer.
And it doesn't impact them at
Right.
all.
Much better to be in a more modern, 1952 mobile home's not a good one to be in.
Right.
If you haven't been taken
Today's
away by a
standards.
tornado already. So we go through these, so we have the uses we've talked about. We have structures and buildings, and this would be the simplest way to look at it. It's a building that doesn't comply with height or setback requirements. That would be a non-conforming structure. And that does come into play. Someone has a building like that, and they want to expand the building. We have restrictions, obviously, in your ability to not expand a non-conforming structure. So you might have a great use going on there, but if the building itself doesn't comply. And I will say that these are cases that can end up in front of the Board of Zoning Appeals for variance. Some of these times, this is the kind of thing that would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Lots, there's, again, a lot that doesn't meet an area or width requirement. We have a number of those out there. This next one here, site aspects, is one you may not be aware of. It is probably one of the most problematic sections of our non-conforming code we have. And this, if you think about it, give you an example. Like if you had a shopping center, or so let's say a department store, might be about a single kind of a store was built, and they built it in 1965. And of course, we had no landscaping requirements, no screening requirements. and you build and you maintain yourself that way, and then you are getting to a point where you're going to reuse the property, redevelop the site, or you want to expand or upgrade the property in some ways, you want to put money into the property to upgrade it, we would go back and look at our site aspect section. And depending on how much money you're putting back into the building will dictate what type of site aspects we would tell you to upgrade. And you can imagine when you get to a point where we tell you to tear out your parking lot and rebuild the parking lot, that becomes quite a costly, and quite frankly, those are people that walk out of the door and say,
I'm not gonna
that's
do
crazy,
that.
can't do that. And so that's side aspects, and that has been a problematic section of our code. It's pretty aggressive, and we've had people, in fact, the way the code is, it's got an increasing amount of site improvement you have to do depending on how much you're putting into the building. We see people pull back on how much reinvestment they want to do. It's not really a good thing for the city to have people do that, but they'll say, well, if I crack that 50% line, it's going to cost me more side aspects, so I'm going to pull back and I'm going to do less improvement. So it's having kind of the opposite effect in a lot of ways of encouraging people to upgrade and restore their buildings because they don't want to get caught where they're going to have to go back and redo the parking lot or redo the landscaping.
Does a lot of that occur?
We've had a fair amount of that. I wouldn't say a lot, and hadn't been as much. We've had a number of occasions where that has happened. One simple one we had was a car wash, wanted to redo their car wash and add a bay. And then when they found out what the non-conforming side aspects, they pulled back and said, we're not going to add a bay. We're just going to kind of pull back. We're not going to invest enough to trigger that and make us redo the parking lot.
And so ultimately, that could be a barrier to an improvement and ultimately kind of hurt the overall area.
I would agree. And I think what we look at, I mean, you have to think about Portsmouth as a whole, how it was built over time, how much was built when there wasn't any zoning. And not, you have little bits of non-conforming things here and there. You had people, we changed the standard. You want to upgrade your parking requirement. That's all well and good. Normally you want to trigger that on new.
Sure.
It's really hard to go back and tell people who've been there or had properties have been there, they need to retroactively upgrade a site to a significant amount. And I will say we've had enough conversation with that with people coming in that it's really a hindrance to development. We think there's other things we can do that would get a similar result, from improving property without being so onerous in terms of cost. And that's what we want to look at. And then again, signs, that would be signs that don't meet current standards. So if you had a 20-foot tall sign and the current standard was 15, you've got a non-conforming sign. And of course, you can keep your sign up there as long as you keep the sign in there. But if you abandon the sign, we have this happen on occasion, sign gets abandoned or the site gets abandoned. Somebody comes back 3 years later, they want to put their sign back up, and that sign pole, like, no, that's, you got to take it down, you got to have a conforming sign. That one I think is an important one if you're trying to improve your overall sign aesthetics of the community. But those are your five categories of nonconformity. We deal with this. This is a regular occurrence in the zoning administrator's office to deal with these types of things. So again, back to what we were just talking about, these issues, we have the nonconformities. Again, uses no longer permitted, and again, that D2 district has been a real problem with that. Buildings that are no longer functionally consistent with permitted uses, again, that D2 district has just been a problem. And then we just went through the discussion on the site aspects. And all of those are just a deterrent to redevelopment and to reinvestment. That's really what we're describing, that non-conforming site aspects. We went through this again before, the non-conforming lots, consolidation, the elimination of lot lines. Some of those cases, what we would call a non-conforming lot, you might have 2 or 3 parcels together in single ownership. It really ends up being really conforming, but our code calls it non-conforming. It makes you fix that. Tell council's recent code amendment you approved. Our code currently on non-conforming signs has a 6-month removal requirement. The state code does not allow that. The state code minimum is 2 years. So again, our code is very aggressive on dealing with these non-conformities. That would not be held up in court if someone were to challenge over you. And then again, we have non-conforming residences and somebody wants to expand the use. You might have a residence in a commercial district, an industrial district, and expand. In that case, you couldn't add an addition or a garage or what have you because of that provision.
Neighborhood, and they could do
Sure. problem. So again, here's what we're proposing. This is our discussion point. I think trying to lay out for you what some of the issues we have with nonconformities. Again, this is really a matter of philosophy. How aggressive do you want to be about taking things out? How fast do you want people to conform to your new code? How willing are you to work with people to use their property in what I would call a more transitional approach as opposed to a transformative approach, what we would describe. So we're gonna recommend this, and again, we're looking for feedback. First thing we're gonna say is we want anything we have in our code about nonconformities to be code compliant with state code. So
Anybody in disagreement with that?
That's a good
state
one.
code says 2 years, we're not saying
That's a good one, yes.
Okay. And I will tell you, when we did the diagnostic, we have a number of things in our code that were not state code compliant in similar fashion, where somebody wanted to be more aggressive, the state one isn't quite.
Really don't have a choice there.
Second, we want to minimize the degree and impact of these non-conforming site aspects.
Everybody in agreement on that? Okay.
Okay. Again, this lot consolidation, we only want to require it for new construction. That's what we do with the patch. This is going to make your patch permanent.
Everybody okay?
Yes.
Okay.
So, again, see, some of those patches have longer life.
Yes.
Again, this is now something we're going to have you consider. You don't really need to have a full answer tonight, but we would like you to consider allowing use of a special exception process. As you recall from before, that would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. It's different than a variance. It carries the same state authority as a use permit, but it doesn't require a 4-month process of going through council. So if someone had a non-conforming use and they want to expand it, you give them the option to go through the Board of Zoning Appeals for a special exception for consideration whether they should be allowed to expand their use. And that's just an option for someone to expand, because there may be non-conforming uses that do not cause a problem. They're not, one thing we talk about not being globally impacted by we have one-size-fits-all regulations. There are always exceptions out there that you might want to consider. So that idea would be if you would like to have people have the opportunity to take their specific non-conforming use and have a consideration for expanding it.
So that would include the residential uses, the person wants to build the pool or the shed?
In this case, it's where the use is non-conforming. Let's say you had a residential, I'll give you, if you had a residential use that was sitting up in the old days up in West Norfolk, and the area was zoned industrial, the house was sitting in. You might have several houses sitting in an industrial zone. They've been there, and nobody's developing an industrial. The code makes it very difficult for them to maintain their property or to make any improvements to it. So if you'd like them to consider, being able to expand or make improvements, that would be a way to allow people in those kind of circumstances to request.
Something with that, you need to be very, very careful, because that can be somewhat of an open situation. So it has to be specifically written to those things that meet the state requirements as well as what we hold dear for the
And what
city.
we're just trying to get your comfort level with having a process like this. There's no requirement to do that.
I support any kind of special exception process. I know one of the things we hit the brick wall on some years ago was that the rules were so restrictive that if it said no, it said no. There was nowhere to go. Couldn't ask you, couldn't ask us, couldn't go to court, couldn't do anything. So, yeah.
How do y'all feel about it?
I agree with
I agree. Yeah.
I did have a question.
Sure.
As far as the number 2, the minimizing the degree impact of non-conforming site, does that go as far as like a change in use?
Current code does.
Would that be lessened? Or
The idea would be, yes, we'd look at lessening all of those. There's some there's a minimum set of standards people need to comply with. What we're trying to do is avoid the over application of a current design standard to an old site.
quite expensive?
Yeah, well, they're, as you know, prohibitively expensive.
Bill?
I support it as long as it's going to be uniform and based on consistency. In other words, John gets his pool and Bill doesn't get his pool. And Lisa
It's a waiting pool.
gets her shed and Nathan is rejected. There's got to be some basis for this exception process.
Let me say this, that's part of what we'd be working on, is coming up with some
Okay.
guidelines for it.
Okay.
I will tell you, we've been working on this idea of the council directed to reduce the number of use permits that come before council. That could just as easily be a use permit, and you could reserve that right to yourself. It's another alternative. What we're trying to do there is, reduce the number of use permits and accelerate people going through an approval process. Of course, the Board of Zoning Appeals is quicker to get to than you are.
Bob, on the second bullet, picking up on what Donna said, would an example be the restaurant in the Churchland Shopping Center, where the Food Line is, wants to expand, and the city comes in and says, well, you got to put planters in the parking lot, and you got to...
I'll give you an excellent example along those lines. PRHA comes in to renovate one of their public housing projects, which we've had this happen. And they come in, they've gotten money from HUD to do interior renovations. And we're like, wait a minute, your parking lot doesn't meet standards, your landscaping doesn't meet standards. Before you've taken almost all of their renovation budget, it's in the parking lot. Because they've got a 1950s, 60s era parking lot. And so we had to work really, really diligently through that problem. That's the one that really got this on my radar, like this is just wrong.
Yeah.
We get to the point where the use itself becomes at risk.
Right.
Because they have to spend so much money renovating the exterior to meet our site aspects. And it's not, fixing the access driveway that's unsafe. This is, putting in landscape islands and changing the lights and
that's
again,
crazy.
landscape buffering, some of those things. And so we're very cognizant of trying to improve appearance along the roadway, like some landscaping things along the frontage. But this would be like tearing out the entire parking lot. And in that case, you get into new stormwater regulations. I mean, the sinkage goes just through the roof. I mean, literally, the stormwater. The other thing I'm sorry, I just want to mention the integration of our regulations. When you deal with zoning, you almost instantly end up in Mr. Wright's office talking about stormwater and E&S. And the new state regulations, very expensive for compliance. I'm trying to, minimize that trip as well.
Dr. Pat?
Yeah, Mr. Bowen and I have met on this and talked about it and looked at words. And I'm just here reading again. Bullet 4, it says, allowing expansion of non-conforming uses through the special exception process. Is expansion the word
Yes.
that we want? And explain that to me, because I'm kind of looking at expansion.
Okay, well, if you think about the use itself being in a contained space.
Okay, that's where
Okay.
you're coming from.
Yeah, so it's in a
Okay.
contained space. I'm sitting in this building
And I want
and I want
to,
to add on to it. I want to put another dining room onto my restaurant. I want to expand. My restaurant's not permitted. I'm non-conforming. Everybody loves me. Great restaurant. Now I want to expand because I'm so popular. We're like, no, we can't. You can't do that because you're expanding the non-conforming use. by doing that. Now that's when you're going to end up getting a rezoning application, which may not necessarily be the best thing. Where people have to go to the sort of the nuclear option to fix what might be a smaller issue.
and that could be for a home or business or
It
whatever.
would apply to anything.
Or,
Apply to anything.
okay, I'm good. with that.
Shannon?
And to the point that Councilman Woody was talking about in terms of consistency, I think that's why, as a body, you really wouldn't want to allow the example that you indicated because it sets a precedent for everybody else, right?
Yeah.
It could.
It could.
If you had similar circumstances.
Sure.
Right. And one other thing I do want to mention, this non-conforming discussion, I'd really be remiss if I didn't mention it. We do have back on the non-conforming lots, let's say you have a lot that's doesn't meet the right lot size requirement. As you know, in any zoning district in Portsmouth, there's a whole list of uses that are allowed
Right.
within that zoning district. And in most zoning ordinances that I've ever seen or worked with, what they would say on a non-conforming lot is any of those uses permitted in that district should be permitted on that non-conforming lot as long as they can meet their setbacks and as long as they don't exceed their height requirements, they can meet their other zoning requirements, parking or whatever. Ours does not say that. Ours reserves the non-conforming lot for single-family homes only. And that is extremely restrictive. I haven't seen that as a common use of a non-conforming lot provision, and that's one we're going to recommend you you modify.
Correct.
Because you just need more. You have non-conforming lots. You have a city that was built when there was no zoning. So when the city was applying zoning, where you might want a 75-foot wide lot, it might have been platted at 70 in one neighborhood. It might have been, 7,500 square foot lot minimum, they might be at 6,900 square feet.
Right.
And they're all zoned the same because you're looking at 5,000 zoning districts. So create non-conformities. Usually try to fix that so it's not a big ordeal for someone to use their property, but current language on our non-conformity makes it a real challenge. So,
Okay. Everybody on board on this?
okay.
Yes.
Another one of our favorite topics, distance separators. Another one-size-fits-all fix in our code that you get away from those use permits, you gotta come up with some other way to make sure we're not gonna have properties impacting their neighbors. So our current zoning code, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna show you a list. I will tell you I don't believe it's complete because they pop up in the oddest places in our code. But we start to look at these. By the way, there's 2 pages of these. So what you can see in this table here, the table of separation requirements, it tells you the use on the left-hand side, it tells you the distance in the middle, and it tells you what you have to separate yourself from. So like in this case, you start off like a family care home, you have to be a half a mile away. That's not state code compliant, by the way, but you have to be a half a mile away from somebody else having that use. You can go down and look at a religious institution, 500 feet from an adult use. You can look at automotive repair 250 feet from a residential zoning, an existing residential use, which is another problematic thing for us because obviously somebody could knock down that existing residential use and that goes away, or a school or a daycare. The second chart here, this is one that's really been more impactful, probably our economic development folks. I talked to you about this for a long time. When we get into some of our industrial uses, and the separation distance required from residential zoning areas. I tell you, I had one example of a property that wasn't 500 feet away from a residential. In between it and the residence was another industrial property and a railroad track. But it still had to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals because it couldn't meet the distance separation requirement. And this is another category of nonconformities you have out there. And I'll give you a visual example, and then we'll come back. A couple of them. This right here, everything's in dark purple. That's your industrial property that can't meet the 500-foot separation distance requirement. So if you're looking to develop any of those properties, either along Airline or Victory down there towards the bottom of the city down there, Frederick Boulevard, you see it up in next to Port Norfolk, and obviously up towards West Norfolk. And so all those sites you see there in purple, is more than 50% of your industrial land can't meet that separation distance requirement.
Got to go.
Show you an example of one, your interchange building. Former Waltney site, see where it's sitting right there, Airline Boulevard, next to it, it's surrounded by a lot of commercial uses around there. If you look across the street, you've got a commercial use across the Airline from it, and then behind that commercial use, there's a back corner of a residential zoning district, it's 320 feet from the property line of the interchange building, and we could not approve them. And they had to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals to get a variance. And speaking on behalf of the Board of Zoning Appeals, which I'll say that after they do 5 or 6 of those things, they tell you to fix your zoning code before we stop approving them. Because that's pointing out you've got something wrong. If you're getting the same variance over and over again. So that's one example. So here again's the list. Again, there are others I find pop up in odd places in there where there's written into a definition or into something else or something.
Okay.
Just curious on this list where it says automotive paint and body shop is 500 foot, but automotive repair and junkyard and salvage are only 250 feet. What's the difference?
250 feet? A lot of these were just numbers. Somebody decided was the right number.
That's what I asked him. Where did these
And I said the same
feet?
answer.
And he told me somebody
Somebody just.
I don't
came
know
up
who,
with it.
somebody came up with it.
The only one I noticed that didn't have any restrictions was adult uses.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's a
Adult uses didn't have any, what?
yeah. You have to
None.
separate yourself from them. They don't separate themselves.
Yeah.
So that's another quirk in zoning there. So in any event, I'm going to tell you what we're going to suggest eliminating all of these and do two things. Number one, we want to put in proper buffer standards.
Right.
Screening and buffering. And if the use is bad enough that it needs a big distance separation, we will make that a use permit requirement. You can deal with that on a case-by-case basis, but you have pretty much handcuffed your economic development department with this kind of.
And planning.
Yeah, we can't, and I was discussing this with Mr. Hartley today. I mean, technically, these are all non-conforming. Anybody we have out there, I was contacted by the treasurer a couple of months ago. Someone over in Port Norfolk had an existing use. I've been there for 40 years, wanted to move over 2 lots and open a new place. They can't do it because you're a budding residential district over there. And even though that industrial residential line has been there since the port in the 50s, we can't, he can't upgrade. He's pretty much kind of stuck where he is. So this does have everyday, real life impact.
Everybody on board with that concept?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So make sure we're all comfortable here. We would be very grateful.
All right.
Okay. We'll do this. So we would like to do eliminate the business separate requirements and reinforce our screening and buffering. Mr. Pace, for our graphic for overlay districts. As our last topic we go through tonight, you may not be aware how our zoning code is structured, but we do have overlay districts in place. Our flood regulations are an overlay district. Our Chesapeake Bay regulations are, even though they're in separate chapters of the code, they are in overlay districts. And for those who aren't familiar with this concept, there's a definition basically there. It's like a sub-district that sits on top of a base zoning district. So for example, if you had a general mixed-use district and you wanted, as I discussed before in the D2 area, you wanted to modify some of the standards, and you could apply an overlay district on top of that where you could tweak some of those things. Obviously, we have our flood protection, Chesapeake Bay, but you want to have an underlying base, and that's one of the things when they adopted the form-based code, they did not keep your underlying base, so we had no fallback position for someone under a base district. The type of things you typically see in an overlay district, a sort of a standard overlay district, you could look at, for example, if you looked at the use table of uses allowed, say, in a general mixed-use district, you can say, well, I think those are all great, but there are a few of those things I'm not so sure about. You could prohibit certain things in there. We have historically done this through conditional zoning. One of the, for those who look at Victory Village is a prime headache of why you don't want to do that, but that property has zoning to it, and then through property owners' proffers, they've done these things. The problem is you can't go back and fix that. That becomes part of the property that only the owner can come back and request be modified. So this is, we believe, a much better concept for Portsmouth, and would be partly our replacement concept for most of our conditional zoning. But you could go through and have, again, standards to deal with nonconformity, setbacks, building heights, building design, if you wanted to get into that, parking, buffering, fencing, all of those things you can build into an overlay. So go back to our D2 district example. So again, we're looking at, so well, I know London, I know High Street, they're not the same street. And we know the whole length of these streets, aren't the same from one end to the other. So you could come in, as just an example, so don't think this is what we're proposing exactly, but this would show you if you're gonna do like a London Boulevard sub-district, or a High Street East sub-district, or a Civic sub-district out where the social services building. Each one of those things could then be treated a little bit more refinement than just saying, well, that's just general mixed use. That's the idea of an overlay district. The D2 needs one, and we're gonna provide one for that. We're working on it as we speak, but that's the concept. And we think this is something we want to build into the zoning ordinance, that someone could come in and request to create an overlay district. And again, I just use the example always comes to mind, Victory Village, Seaboard Square would be another place you could have done something like that. Instead of a conditional zone, we're wiping out all these uses so you can never have all these things in there. You could have done that through an overlay. It's just easier to modify, for city council to modify, put it that way. So that's that concept there. Go back. So we need to have an overlay district concept. Again, we're already using it. Just want to make sure council's comfortable with the idea of potential expanded use, because we're going to spend some time working on these going forward. So if you're not comfortable with the overlay concept, it'd be helpful for you also to let us know now, so we don't go down a path that you're comfortable with.
How do y'all feel about it?
I think it's
that'll work.
That's an idea.
absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
Because there's
On
differences.
this side, what do you,
Fine.
I like the idea.
okay,
Okay.
Okay?
all right.
All right, we're doing well. We're almost to the end here. So, a few other things we want to talk about moving forward. On the staff radar, and this is something I know the mayor has mentioned more than one time, that we're a port city, that port in our name, we don't have a port listing in our zoning ordinance. We're well aware of that. It's become a little bit more of a broader issue for us now. Something you may or may not be aware of, but a couple of years ago, when we were dealing with the issues related to VIG and their site plan and the requirements that apply, we've got an opinion sent to us from the Attorney General's office saying that anything that is a port activity, and the Chesapeake Bay program has an undefined term, but anything that's a port activity is exempt from Chesapeake Bay requirements. That's not an exemption from stormwater, but it's an exemption from Chesapeake Bay requirements. And they exempted all of VIG. And so, we'll be, I'll just tell you from the planning department, we might have somebody come in and want to put in a 10 by 10 patio and tell them, oh, you got this Chesapeake Bay requirements. But, and when the state exempted it, they said everything on that property is a port activity. That's the office building, the gate, the guardhouse, chassis storage, rail yard,
Does that include the
everything.
areas around the VIG property too, like
Well,
Port West
everything
Norfolk?
that's, in that case, it's part of the VIG property.
But not necessarily the areas
This
nearby.
also will apply on the state level, PMT property, when they go through a state review, because the state does site plan review for them, they will also be exempt from Chesapeake Bay. So when we go in and define what a port is in Portsmouth, we will have the impact if we have other facilities in Portsmouth that it might be a port-related facility. Because we do an overlay for our Chesapeake Bay, we might be exempting them from Chesapeake Bay requirements. And that may be a good or a bad thing, depending on your perspective, but it's given us a little bit more pause to look at the definition of what we want to cover as a port, because you can have a fairly broad definition. For example, people who service the port,
Like a warehouse.
commercial diving, warehousing, wharf construction, those types of things that come in and say this is all port-related, tugboat repair. There's a whole lot of things that people might claim that they're port-related, and so we're going to have to work to refine that definition. But we will have that in there. We will cover that, make sure we don't have our port activities outside of the zoning ordinance. Just mentioned a couple things that I think you might be somewhere. We'll take a look at the solar and wind systems. That's just because we have some provisions for them, but we need to do some further refinement. And then entertainment establishments. I think that's another thing City Council's always quite interested in, how we regulate those things, and we know we need to go back and spend some time revisiting what we regulate as requiring a use permit, and what we don't. What is entertainment? And sometimes our code, where it talks about like amplified music, for example, is that piped out music into a dining area? You're talking about a DJ, and we need to be a little bit clearer on that. Other things we're tracking, and right now we're not really working as far as writing the code sections for. We're talking about some federal and state activities primarily related to regulating the cannabis industry. We know the state every year. I just mentioned one thing that something everybody's aware of. Our zoning ordinance is the one code you have that you change constantly. It's a living regulatory element. You're never going to be done with it. You'll always have amendments to it. Every General Assembly session you'll end up with something. It just depends on what they do. So the cannabis industry, if they move to legalize or modify the way these things, the products are distributed, we'll have to look at that. There's a lot of discussion going on about computer gambling, and how we deal with that. It's not really clear right now what's gambling, what's some of these places. I noticed down on the outside of Portsmouth, the Miller Mart, I think it's in Chesapeake, down near Chesapeake Square's got games in the 7-Eleven. They're popping up everywhere. So I know it's an issue that the consumer revenue is very concerned with.
Well, their computer games in Portsmouth.
Right, oh yeah, they're
Lots
out
of
there.
them.
Tons of them.
Games of skill, gambling, and we're gonna look for some further guidance from the state. That's why we have this on our radar there. And again, the 5G, the small cell stuff, every year, either the state or the federal government wants to preempt some other level of local regulation, so we're just tracking that.
Elizabeth?
You mentioned the cannabis industry. Do we have appropriate zoning necessary for the New York company?
What we have right now, we do. What we don't have, just give you an example of that case. You look at the way Virginia regulated it, and if you think about it, treating it more like a pharmaceutical processing. So we do in our code, our industrial zone, we allow that kind of processing. What they couldn't do, which other states do, is go outside of their property and start growing their raw materials. So they have to do all that inside the building. So all of their materials, I think they start basically from seed and have to go to product inside the building. But if the state were to come back and say, now we've decided to let them grow stuff outside our code, because we don't have any agricultural uses, and in the industrial district, we don't really look at, accessory community gardens or gardening or things of that nature as an accessory to an industrial use. We'd have to go back, and that could be a relatively small tweak, but it just depends on how the state decides to proceed. If they go forward and they start doing something separate about how you dispense, we'd have to look at that. We just have to look at the language of the state code, work with the city attorney's offices, to whether or not what we have on the books matches or if we need to modify.
But we're okay for them now?
Right now, we're good. They're out there working in the building, so we're good.
Christian?
Yes.
So you're saying what you're tracking with the cannabis industry and the computer gambling venues, so if someone wanted to develop one or open a business, it would have to be in a specific area?
That might be exactly. How the state regulates. We were getting information come from the ABC board. They were kind of the first people we started seeing regularly. They were looking at some of these things, what they would call gambling and not gambling.
Right.
And of course, a lot of these things were occurring inside of vape shops.
Vape shops,
Yeah,
yes.
the vape shops, and they started turning up in restaurants/bars. The
Right.
same kind of things start turning up in there. And so there's no real guidance on vape shops, guidance on games of chance, games of skill, gambling, and so we'll have to look at all of that. And as they refine that, go back and look at our code again. We're going to commission revenue and their enforcement on that as well.
Yeah, and this talking about the computer gambling, I've had a lot of complaints and issues about that. And like you said, originally the ABC board, they kind of put their foot in their mouth and semi-approved some machines. ABC has stepped back from that.
That's
Their
right.
letter that's gone to all their establishments
They gotta
says you
close
have to check with your local Commonwealth attorney.
Right.
I believe just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Commonwealth attorney in Charlottesville has made a stand and told these people they're illegal and got to put them out. The Attorney General hasn't made an opinion on it yet, but it's still the issue, just like you said, between game of skill and game of chance. Game of chance currently is illegal by the state code, and that's the problem. The way they're getting by with these games of skill, basically it's a regular slot machine. You get your 3 cherries.
That's
The way you
good.
win is ask you a question, what's 3 plus 5? Pick the right answer, that throws the skill in it, and then they win their money. So if it doesn't have that skill in it, technically the other machines at this point are already illegal.
You lose.
So, I think it's, at some point, that's a discussion that we have to have with our city attorney and our police department and Commonwealth Attorney's office, because the ones that don't have the skill in it, they're already illegal. We just need to start enforcing them, because there's starting to be issues and there's so much cash involved in these businesses.
Yeah.
That's what's luring the robberies to come in, because it's a lot of money to be had.
And we can tell you, one internal of the zoning ordinance, our take, the way the codes are written, if it doesn't permit it, it's considered not permitted. Same thing I've told the Commissioner of Revenue, we don't consider any of these things, the gambling side, whatever you want to call it. If you think that's what they're doing, then that might be a criminal activity. We don't have any
Right.
thing that says you can do that. But at some point, maybe that we would need to go and clarify our zoning position on that. I think City of Chesapeake has taken a stab at some of that. They may be the one locality that's
Well,
trying to do that.
Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, and Suffolk, I know all of them have.
So we're looking at that, but it's a moving target. And so as I said, we're tracking that, but consider the size of this the rest of the projects we're working on. We're trying not to get kind of bogged down over there. We'll definitely keep that on.
Change the math question, square root of 80.
What are these vape shops and gambling things considered as far as a use? I mean, because they're
Vape shops are
everywhere.
retail. They're just treated as retail. That's it. I mean, what they're selling there is not considered an illegal product. It's just what happens once you get in there. It might be. But as far as a zoning, a vape shop is a retail use.
How is that any different than an adult use kind of facility then? I mean, really?
Yes.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the City Council, members of the Planning Commission. As Mr. Baldwin has said, there have been a number of discussions over the last couple of years when these establishments came online. As it relates to this particular discussion, zoning is probably the last line of regulation with regard to this. And we've had these discussions with various parties, but as Councilman Clark mentions, when the ABC introduced some confusion, that created some impediments for both police and the Commonwealth Attorney. Now, had any of them acted, as I think in other cities, where those entities had acted, then you can enforce from a zoning aspect whether or not your business is in compliance with your zoning. But where we've had this sort of neutrality with regard to the other entities enforcing, it's created some impediments with regard to the Commissioner of Revenue in terms of what he can do and what his determinations are. When those three things have not been clarified, then of course zoning is the last thing. If you have enforcement actions, if you have criminal activity, those are reasons to get in front of your zoning boards or whatnot and determine whether or not that use should continue. But when you have no record of any of that information, zoning really is the last line to be involved if we're talking about essentially law enforcement from that standpoint. But we've had those discussions, and hopefully, as I understand, with ABC changing their position, because the first thing that we were all presented with 3 years ago was the ABC opinion that said they are not going to enforce. And so that sort of, in my discussions, in line with the planning department, I've said to everyone, we're the last ones to come to. I mean, the other entities really have to act first, and then we can address a business from a zoning and an operational standpoint.
And that only applies to those operations that sell an ABC product.
It did, but it left all elements of the regulatory enforcement in a quandary as to whether or not that statement was sufficient, because at the same time there were inquiries about the AG in terms of giving an opinion. So we were sort of all left waiting for an answer, some other contrary answer or a definitive answer, an overriding opinion, as opposed to what the ABC put out, I want to say 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now.
Let's say that the ABC changes its position and clarifies it and says these machines are not allowed in buildings that sell an ABC product. How can we regulate a vape shop then?
Well, you know,
we have the statutory authority to do that?
Given the way, what I suspect is it's going to be dominoes. It's a domino effect. ABC reversing itself will sort of clear the path for all of the other entities that come before zoning to change their positions or clarify. I suspect we won't have this Attorney General vacuum for much longer. There are some things, I believe, even in the discussion last year, and I'm doing my last reviews on those matters, where there was some intent to tighten up this regulation as it relates to these games of skill. And so I suspect we're going to have a whole sea change shift from the AG, commissioners, police department, Commonwealth Attorney, now that they're being sought after in terms of their opinion. I suspect it's all just going to collapse, for lack of a better word, or the regulatory scheme is going to change between now and a couple of months beyond July.
Very good. We've been waiting for this.
We have.
A vape shop doesn't sell alcohol, right?
It does not.
I've never been in one. I
It
don't
does
know.
not.
It does not.
Typically, it does not. And so
Nor
that,
food, I
that
don't think.
the ABC change in opinion wouldn't necessarily immediately impact vape shops.
And that was the nature of my question.
However, but once someone from an ABC store gets an opinion from the Commonwealth Attorney, that is that person's opportunity to clarify across the board.
Well, that's with the ABC issue, because I spoke to somebody from ABC last week about this issue, and that was the thing. They never regulated them. They just, their original letter was they sent out to all their establishments that these games were okay and they were allowed to do it. They're not going to say take them out. Now they have backed up, and their letter says it's up to the Commonwealth Attorney in your jurisdiction. Basically, ABC has said we have no opinion on them whether they're legal or not legal. They're out of it. So they're waiting on a legal opinion from somewhere for it to be enforced. So they're not on either side. They don't want to be in the middle of that because they really can't act unless there is a legal opinion on it. And what happened was these people said, well, if they're allowed to have them, then we could have them. And that's kind of what messed up, is because ABC, it almost sounded like they were legal. And the problem is once they said that, it's hard for any other agency to go against a state law enforcement agency that's already said that. And that's what created the problem.
Right. That's what happened.
I mean, in lies a bigger concern or a bigger issue. If these vape shops have these illegal machineries, are they reporting to the Commission of Revenue the appropriate income that's received from that, and how do we get, that's where we want to get to. We want to get to where,
Or the people
show me the
winning
money. Show me the
They're not
money.
reporting that.
Well, I can only speak anecdotally. My understanding is that a significant number of them, perhaps all of them, want to be considered legal and produce, but it is still a confusion in terms of what they are under all of our regulatory schemes. They may want to report those monies, but there again, some of the early discussion was if I am a regulator of a particular business and you submit the money to me, if I approve it, am I approving what was a questionable legal or illegal use?
Right.
And so it has created a bit, this is not a completely accurate analogy, but sort of technology has overwhelmed or gotten in advance of the law. And so everybody has been sitting here in a bit of a fog in terms of who can enforce and what the appropriate measure is.
But it's more than money, it's the use. I mean, we have to determine if we think that it's gambling, is that the appropriate use for that particular area? And I think that almost trumps the money aspect. So someone has to say whether or not it's gambling or skill.
Right.
But for the 3 + 4 = 7, it's gambling.
And that's where the issue comes from, is because there is nobody in state that regulates it.
Right.
The lottery has nothing to do with those machines.
Right.
ABC doesn't do anything with machines.
Right.
There is no gaming commission in Virginia, so there's really not anybody that has training that can go in there and determine whether it's a game of chance or a game of skill at this point. Because if it doesn't have that silly skill added to it, it's already illegal under state code. What the problem is we don't have anybody trained in law enforcement that can go in there and make that determination. So it's hard to charge them.
Well, so is cannabis is illegal too. You don't see anybody going to prison for it now or being arrested for it. I don't think it'll be. I don't think these small-time operators will be dealt with until gaming laws are passed in Virginia.
Right.
Then I think the big money in the casinos will see to it that the small vape shop operators won't have them. And the law will be written as such to put them out of business. Wait and see.
Questions?
What we have for tonight, I guess I've asked a global question. If you have any other questions about our project in general, or anything about what we went over tonight specifically?
Go over what lies ahead as far as schedule. When
Right.
can we anticipate this before us for final adoption?
I would say you're gonna get the final adoption, I'm gonna say first of the year timeframe. We may take a look at, for example, pulling that D2 form-based code and doing a rezoning piece in advance of the rest of the code being done. They have to come before you to do the overlay district. Because that's still continue to have an everyday effect on people out there trying to develop in that district. Form-based code regulations still apply. They do have the ability to come in and request use permits to modify, but we would like to work forward on that. But the goal for us is to get this thing out to a point of being able to move forward by the end of the year, which would put you into kind of January, February.
Can we make a commitment to each other that we work hard to get this thing adopted by, at least by the end of January?
Could we try to
Before our retreat or
Push
after
for
the
Yeah.
retreat?
I'm fine with December.
Holidays, we're gonna lose people on holidays working on this. I'm a little concerned with.
Let's work to see if we can have it done by December, but we will keep you posted,
Yeah.
okay?
All right, end of the year. Yes, sir, Paul.
The board and your department controls this. You're making this. The greatest interest that I have is that we create no liable situations and that we don't leave those open in where I can go in and practically do anything I want. That's my interest as a council person. I won't try to do your job, but that's what I ask as a council person.
We'll discuss.
Other comments?
I just wanted to make a comment. I'd like to, on behalf of myself and Vice Mayor Lucasberg, who serve on the Planning Commission, I just want to thank you guys for all your efforts and really putting so much thought into this. I mean, I've learned a whole lot in the last 6 months about zoning and the impact and why it's so important for cities to have those things in place. So thank you guys for your efforts, and we look forward to having the test run before we actually get to driving.
For that ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other? Well, thank you, sir. We still have business, so if you want to adjourn your meeting.
We will, Mr. Mayor, but first of all, let me thank the city council for allowing us to be here and participate. It's always a pleasure when we join together and we can be unified in what we're trying to do for the citizens of this city.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again. We wanted this to be a partnership process.
Right.
This commission meeting is adjourned.
Okay. You're adjourned. We'll take a 5-minute recess to allow everybody to stretch. All right, we're going to go back into session now. And we have a need to go into a closed session, a closed meeting. Is there a motion?
I move to go into a closed meeting, A, pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A3, for the purpose of discussing the acquisition and disposition of real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, specifically regarding casino development, and B, pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A8, for the purpose of consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by the public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel, specifically regarding the recent notices of claims, including pending litigation and potential litigation.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? Madam Deputy Clerk, will you call the roll, please, on
Mr.
this?
Battle?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mr. Glover?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Lucasberg?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Ms. Simmons?
Yes.
Mayor Rowe?
Yes, we're in closed session.